Welcome to episode 10 of the Autumn Brookman Show. We're going to be jumping into an interview with the president of El Salvador that has a lot of great content you won't want to miss. So let's get started. Our first segment today is Cultural Conversations, and we'll be focusing on an interview TuckerCarlson completed with the president of El Salvador, President Bukele. If you don't know his story, President Bukele faced tremendous opposition, but still was elected as president. He asked for his people to elect members to Congress to support his goals, and they did. They got a supermajority in Congress, and they were able to make significant changes. President Bukele's leadership changed El Salvador from a gang-controlled country to the country with the lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere. Let's just take a look at some of this incredible data. First, we're going to look at this data from insightcrime.org. This data is from 2018 and it lists the homicide rates in Latin American countries and the Caribbean. You can see on this map that El Salvador has a homicide rate of 51 per 100,000. You can see that the lowest homicide rate is Chile with 2.7 per 100,000, and that there's only one country that topped El Salvador this year in 2018, and that was Venezuela with a homicide rate of 81.4 per 100,000. So you can see that in 2018, El Salvador's rate was very high, very dangerous place to be. And we can compare that to last year's data. So this is from 2023. So we're looking at Statista. Their data set, it's entitled Homicide Rates in Selected Latin American and Caribbean Countries in 2023. So we see a much different list. We've got Jamaica at the top. They've got 60.9 per 100,000. And we have to scroll all the way down to the bottom to see El Salvador with 2.4 per 100,000. So what a significant change that went from being at the top of the list all the way down to the bottom of the list. What a transformation. So of course the big question is, how did he do it? And TuckerCarlson actually asked him the same thing.
So just bottom line it for us, what's the formula?
Well, I can tell you the official formula and the real formula.
Okay.
So he goes on and he discusses this plan that they rolled out that has several phases, first phase, second phase, third phase, and so on. And explains that because of the response of the gangs, the violence that they caused in revolt to the changes that he was making, they had to roll out the latter phases very quickly. And then he discusses what some elements of those phases were. So we're going to jump to that part of the interview.
Well, the phases included building up of the police forces, the army. We doubled the army. We literally doubled the army to fight crime, to use the army to fight crime. And we equipped them before, like soldiers. We didn't have useful guns or vehicles, drones. Basic things that an operation of that magnitude would need.
And just to provide some context here, so the response of the gangs, right, that they were responding to is that they had murdered 87 people in just a few days. And for a country the size of El Salvador, that's very significant. That's like in our country as if it was 5,000 people murdered in a few days. And you can just imagine the type of fear that would create in our culture. So you can see that their response was significant, right? They really needed to combat the gangs to ensure that they didn't gain control back and that they were able to, eliminate this violence. So what we're curious about now, right? He laid out the official plan, but what was the real method that he was talking about?
What's the real?
It's a miracle.
It's a miracle.
Yeah, it's a miracle.
I love that. What do you mean?
Yeah.
So even though we can see that he had a plan, he rolled it out, his plan worked, he still gives credit to God for the transformation of his country. And he explains in a little bit more detail just how that miracle rolled out.
Almost an impossible task.
It's a guerrilla war, really.
Yes, but it was an impossible task because you have to go after them. They were intertwined with the population. They were everywhere, and they were killing randomly. So how do you stop that? So we really will try to figure out what to do, and I basically said, well, we're looking into an impossible mission here. So we pray, and we.
You prayed in the meeting?
Yes, of course, several times. Yeah.
What did you pray for?
To wisdom, to win the war, to have. I thought at the time that we would have civilian casualties, so we said we prayed that the civilian casualties will be as low as possible, and we didn't have any civilian casualties.
So I find this story to be so uplifting. It gives us hope that God is still at work. We can see the transformation in El Salvador and see that things can go from bad to good. And there is a way out. There is hope. And we need to follow President Bukele's example and seek God's wisdom for the situations going on in our own nation. Too often people stay away from any rhetoric that implies asking for God's wisdom, giving credit to God for something. And this is another topic, just this issue of faith and politics and being able to openly talk about your faith that President Bukele addresses later on in the interview. So let's take a quick listen to what he had to say about that.
The first point of my plan is seek God's wisdom.
Yes.
That is what you said.
Yeah, I said that, yeah.
Why would that be the first point of an economic plan?
Why wouldn't it be? What should be the first part of the plan?
Well, I think it should be.
Yeah.
But I can't.
And most people would think that, right?
I've never heard any leader of any country say that.
Because they probably forgot to represent the people that elect them, yeah.
And I love that statement. I think it's so profound, right? We elect our representatives to go to Congress, right? To go to the Senate, to go to whatever we elected them for, and we expect them to represent, right, our ideals and our beliefs. And yet at the same time in America, we have all this talk about the separation of church and state. And people often don't realize what this separation meant. It in no way meant to strip all religious language from political discourse. As a Christian involved in politics, whether an elected official or a citizen discussing political ideas, you do not need to strip away your worldview in order to engage. It is wise to seek God's counsel, and it is not wrong to say so. We see religious rhetoric in many of our historical documents and records of speeches from the past. We should be electing people who will represent our ideals. And that goes beyond just people who make the sorts of speeches we want. We want leaders who are actually seeking God's wisdom and will enable our society to flourish in a godly way, right, as we can see President Bukele has done for his nation of El Salvador. We see our own country so far away from many of the original values that made us great. And President Bukele had some insight into why our nation has drifted so far. And he talks about the need to maintain our democracy, right? Any system, any structure needs maintenance and needs to be taken care of. We can't just let things go by the wayside and not be concerned and hope things get better. He talks about the incentives of electing officials, right, in this democratic manner. If an elected official promises to spend more money, it's often easier for them to get elected. And we see this happening all the time. Promises to fund school initiatives, promises to cancel student loans, handing out stimulus checks, and so on. And here is his response about what to do.
Democracy works. Nobody can say it doesn't, because it worked in the United States, right? But if you don't maintain, if you don't give maintenance to the system, it will fall like the wall if you don't give maintenance to it. Because the same system will degrade itself. So what you're having right now is a huge erosion of Western civilization. So we have governments pandering to their bases, to their ideology because they mobilize the vote or whatever.
So our country is in decline, but it is not lost. We need to evaluate and be honest about where we are. We need to see what processes aren't working. We need to make adjustments as a people and see the reality of where we're at. I would strongly recommend that you watch this full interview. I found it very refreshing and hopeful to see that there are good things happening, and I enjoyed his perspective of what's going on in the world, what he did in his own country, and what he sees happening globally. There are so many leaders who are letting us down, who make empty promises, who've become corrupted, or who just seem clueless. And here we see a world leader who seeks God's wisdom, who follows through, and who has made successful change for his people. It gives us some hope that that positive change is also possible here. There is one more topic from this interview that I want to show you before we jump into our next segment. Obviously, with fighting back the gangs, President Bukele knows about the ferocity of gang violence. But I was surprised to learn about some spiritual components. So let's take a listen.
Killing more people just to get territory or to fight against rival gangs or to, collect debts or, money or whatever. But as the organization grew, they became satanic. They started doing satanic rituals. I don't know exactly when that started, but it was well documented.
Yes.
And in our arrest, we've even found altars and things like that.
Yes, I've seen them.
And so they became a satanic organization. And even when you, sometimes when you interview gang members that are in prison, they will say, I'm out of the gang.
We're going to dive a little bit deeper into this in our next segment, Crazy News. For today's segment of Crazy News, we're going to talk about the link between MS-13 and Satanism. I was surprised to find out that MS-13 was satanic, but at the same time, that's really not surprising. I mean, of course, such violence has a source. After watching this interview that we just talked about, I did some research, and I want to show you some of what I found. So we'll start with this one. This is from the United States Attorney's Office, Eastern District of New York. Fugitive high-ranking MS-13 leader arrested on terrorism charges. Defendant was a member of MS-13's original 12 Apostles of the Devil and Ranfla Nacional leadership structure in El Salvador, Mexico, and the United States. This report from the United States Attorney's Office came out hours after I had watched the interview. Before seeing the interview, I knew about MS-13. I knew they were a violent gang. I knew they had immigrated here, but I did not know that they were connected to Satanism. Now, after hearing it, of course, it makes sense that with all the violent things they do, that they would be connected to the work of Satan. There are some other stories that also caught my attention. Here's an article from the LA Times. This article is from 2021. This article is from 2024, from March 21st of 2024. It's about another arrest of an MS-13 member, and this was actually also another one of the 12 Apostles of the Devil. The title of this article is MS-13 leader, one of FBI's most wanted fugitives, arrested at California-Mexico border. The article discusses the connections to El Salvador and immigration. A CBS article, which is also from 2024, is entitled MS-13 Gang Leader, who prosecutors say turned D.C. area into hunting ground, sentenced to life in prison. And the President Bukele actually talked about how MS-13 has, different places in the U.S. where they are, and Washington, D.C. is one of those that he brought up. This article brings out other trials of MS-13 gang members. At one point in the article, it says prosecutors say that Canales joined the gang at age 14 or 15 while he was living in El Salvador, that he came to the U.S. illegally in 2016 to evade arrest warrants in that country. Right, so that more clearly makes the link between illegal immigration and the fact that we see this gang activity happening in the United States. Another article comes from the Washington Post. It says, you feel that the devil is helping you. MS-13's satanic history. So this article is a little bit older. This is from 2017, right? But it's describing the connection between the activities of MS-13 and Satanism. It states in the article, some of the gang's founders were devil-worshipping metalheads, according to experts. And although the connection has waned over the past 30 years, it can still be seen in MS-13's use of satanic nicknames, tattoos, and other imagery. The gang's devil horns hand sign is known as La Garra, a Spanish reference to Satan's claws. And some MS-13 members have told investigators that they committed their crimes at the behest of La Bestia, or the Beast. The Beast wanted a soul, an MS-13 member nicknamed Diabolical said after killing a 15-year-old girl who disrespected his satanic shrine, prosecutors told the Houston courtroom earlier this year. Right, so we clearly see the link between, right, Satan compelling them and driving them to these acts of violence. And this even goes all the way up into Canada. Right, we have an article from the Toronto Sun. It says, hyper-violent MS-13, part street gang, part satanic cults, pure evil. And this article discusses the spread of the gang all the way up into Canada. They stated, as politicians dozed, MS-13 became entrenched in the U.S., Central America, Mexico, and now Canada. And the last article I have for you is from the Associated Press, and this article is from 2017. It says 3 teen girls kidnapped by Salvadoran gang in Houston. The first sentence says 2 MS-13 gang members from El Salvador, both in the United States, illegally held 3 teenage girls against their will and killed one of them in a satanic ritual, authorities in Houston said Friday. So why would we need to talk about MS-13 and their link to Satanism? Well, this news is a reminder that we are fighting a spiritual battle. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." However, we must understand that the battle has a physical manifestation. Just because the battle is spiritual, that does not mean there are not human victims. That does not mean that the legal battles that go on are meaningless. The wins and losses of the spiritual battles affect what happens to us. So I want to take a moment and just go back to the interview with TuckerCarlson and President Bukele, because he talks about this exact issue.
So,
Yes.
but I guess my point is you saw it as that.
Yes, of course. There's a spiritual war and there's a physical war. And the physical war could be, that's the unofficial.
Yes.
That's the unofficial version. The spiritual, if you win the spiritual war, it will reflect into the physical war. So I don't know what I would call it, our impressive victory was because we won the spiritual war.
So remember the context here. President Bukele changed El Salvador from the most dangerous country in the world by their homicide rate, according to some data sites, to the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. That is a huge transformation. And we can see the physical manifestation of that, just looking at the data. But what we don't necessarily see is the spiritual war that was going on. But we understand that we are a part of the spiritual war as well. And the spiritual is not limited to particular nations. We see evil happening around us in the United States. As I've just shown you, the violence of MS-13 is here in our nation. And we have other evils as well. Abortion has been linked to satanic rituals. We have people who want to start Satan clubs in schools. And I don't have a news story that links child mutilating surgeries with satanic cults, but I know that this is also a part of a spiritual battle. We don't have to wait for the news to catch up with what we know. It is vital for us to be grounded in the truth of God's word, to seek God's wisdom in our decisions, and to engage in our government in a way that will lead to the good of our society. Up next, we're going to take a look at random reactions. For today's random reactions, we're going to be looking at a video that's called California Bullet Train Project Faces Funding Challenges. And we'll see that these challenges are very significant. So let's take a look.
California's mega high-speed rail project between San Francisco and Los Angeles facing another major funding hurdle. Today in the Bay's Ginger Conejero-Saab is live in San Francisco this morning. And Ginger, I've covered this story for years and years and years. I would think at this point I'd be able to write on it.
That's what you and many others were hoping for, Laura, but we're told more money is needed to make progress on this project, and it's a lot more money. In fact, $100 billion, and that's not all. California High-Speed Rail Project CEO Brian Kelly testified this week at the State Senate Transportation Committee about the authority's updated draft business plan. Kelly told lawmakers he had $28 billion on hand, but that is still several $billion short to make progress on the Central Valley segment between Madera and Merced. He said he's hoping to fill that gap with federal funds to get it to the projected $32 to $35 billion cost. That part of the project is now expected to be fully operational at the earliest by 2030. Now, aside from the money to fill the gap in the Central Valley, project leaders still need an additional $100 billion to complete the bullet train from San Francisco to Los Angeles. You're seeing a map of the phases of this project. Phase 1 will connect San Francisco and Merced to Los Angeles and Anaheim. Phase 2 will add Sacramento to Merced and San Diego to Los Angeles. Now, you'll remember voters were originally pitched the idea back in 2008. The expectation then was that this would be complete by now, but almost 16 years later, there's no definitive end date in sight.
Right now, the air is being sucked out of the room funding-wise by this one project. How do we get the public on board with something that has this much of a downside to it, funding-wise?
I think the only way you get the public is by performing better. And I think the authority is performing better today than it was, and I think it will going forward.
So President Bukele again actually referenced this project in reference to just an example of how our country just isn't functioning like it used to. So, I mean, all the way back in 2008, this project was pitched and it's supposed to already be done. But just the logistics, the way, right, the government can get things going and hits all these hurdles, it just hasn't happened. So something in our system is just not working. Now, what this video actually reminds me of is when I was working as a teacher in the public school system. So I remember going to this training. I think this was my first year teaching. And it was just this new initiative in the schools, a new way they were going to train the teachers. And then I remember the teacher next to me, who had been, a teacher for a while, was just like, oh, just wait a few years and they're going to do another initiative. And I just felt like, that would seem like such a jaded view of things, but it didn't take me very long working in the school district to realize how accurate that was. They start something, they try to get the data to look good, and then they just start something else, try to get the data to look good, right? Every time a new person wants to be elected, they want to do some new initiative to get the numbers bumped up, to make themselves look like they were a great politician, and then kind of move on to the next thing. They're not really thinking long term. And there's so much money, right, that people want to throw at schools, right? That sounds like a great campaign promise. Oh, we'll make more money for schools, a new technology initiative, a new teacher training program, this new great reading program, or whatever thing they want to do. They just throw more money at it. And the schools really don't get much better, even though all this money is going there. And then we see, right, with this train project, it's just money, we need more money, and like the results just aren't there, right? We can't have this mindset of just giving things more money and then they'll work, right? Sometimes it's the people who have less money and have to make do with what they have, but they're focused and on task, they steward what they have well, and they're able to make it work. So it's really about just going back to basics, going back to prioritizing, what does our society really need? What do we need to focus on? What do we need to spend our resources on? And just being more realistic about just not throwing money at things that will really help us be able to move forward and not get stuck in these types of situations where we have ongoing projects, deadlines that aren't being met, and ultimately voters who just end up being disappointed. Well, thanks so much for joining us for episode 10. As always, I look forward to hearing from you. I love reading your comments, what you thought, what you have to say. Again, I'd really just encourage you, if you want to hear some good news going on in the world, to watch that interview of TuckerCarlson and President Bukele. It's just really good perspective, even about, some of the bad things going on, but you get to hear the uplifting things, the good news of how El Salvador has really transformed. So thanks again for joining us, and remember to live in truth.